Welcome to this episode of Brazilian Today. Today we have Professor Aníbal Pérez Liñán with us from the Department of Political Science. Thank you very much, Professor Aníbal, for joining us today to talk about these very important topics in Brazil. So I'd like to start with our general question. Is Brazilian democracy in danger today? And of course, when you think about today, about the dangers of Brazilian democracy today, I guess we have to go back at least to 2014 when President Dilma Rousseff was elected. The opposition party did not really accept that defeat. 2 years later, she was impeached in a very controversial impeachment. So can you tell us a little bit about the context of Brazil during those years? And very important, do you think that impeachment really strengthened our Brazilian democracy, or was it sign that there was something wrong with the institutions?
So I think that, after a period of great enthusiasm and optimism for Brazil in the early 21st century, then, as you pointed out, by 2014, there were signs that democracy was in trouble, that the population was feeling frustrated with the democratic process, that there were some problems. And that started, as you point out, with the re-election of President Dilma Rousseff in 2014, perhaps a year before, when there were protests against the government in 2013 because of some raises in bus tariffs. And then after President Rousseff was re-elected, the opposition kind of questioned the result of the election. And then, as you mentioned, by 2016, President Rousseff was highly unpopular, the economy was in trouble, and President Rousseff was impeached on grounds that were very questionable. So as you pointed out, the impeachment was highly controversial. So today we have this perception that Brazilian democracy is at risk. But in a way, the trouble started before. There has been a process by which the population has been discontent with democracy. And it's very hard to separate that with the state of the economy, right? When the economy was booming in the early 21st century, people were happier, more willing to tolerate the failures of their democracy. When the economy got in trouble after 2013, then people became less tolerant with their politicians. And of course, now we have further economic crisis, the COVID crisis, and a president that is highly controversial. So this is the state now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's very interesting you mentioned political and economic crisis, right? Because history shows us that in Latin America, those are the conditions, right? When there's some instability, then there are authoritarian forces who tend to take over. So maybe those were the conditions for the rise of our current president, Jair Bolsonaro, right? The crisis, the polarization, a very controversial figure who rises and becomes the president, right? So talking about him today, he was rightfully and legitimately elected in 2018. But among the many controversies, and we're talking about democracy, is the instability between his administration and the executive he represents and the judiciary the judiciary in Brazil, the Supreme Court especially. So it has been this perennial state of war with the Supreme Court in Brazil. Can you tell us about the risks of that kind of instability between the branches of government?
Sure. President Bolsonaro never made a secret of his inclination to defend strong executive power and a very strong form of leadership. And what this means is that he's particularly sensitive to separation of powers and social forces that in some way constrain his leadership. This is not only happening in Brazil, right? It's very common in many democracies in the world nowadays, as we have seen. And so what this means is that President Bolsonaro naturally has a tendency to clash with institutions that impose constraints on him, either social institutions like the mass media or institutions like the electoral system that in some way may produce a defeat for his party or his political movement, or the Supreme Federal Tribunal, that is the Brazilian Supreme Court, that in many cases will establish restrictions for what the executive branch can do, right? So, not surprisingly, President Bolsonaro has clashed with all of those forces, including the Supreme Court. And what is distinctive about Brazil, I think, in contrast with most Latin American countries, is that the judiciary historically has been very strong, very independent, and very stable. So there is a tradition of a very strong judiciary, not necessarily a very activist judiciary, not necessarily a judiciary that is super willing to clash with politicians, right? Mm-hmm. Sometimes the Brazilian judiciary has been willing to challenge politicians, such as in the example of the Lava Jato scandal, right? The investigation that led to the political crisis of 2016. But in many other cases, the Brazilian judiciary has been very cautious of confronting top politicians. However, there are many situations in which, because they're interpreting the Constitution, they are forced to confront the executive and stop some of the goals of the executive, and this has created a natural confrontation with the executive branch.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you touched upon so many important topics that I'd like to further discuss. One of them is our voting system. In Brazil, as you know, we have a very efficient, reliable electronic voting system. We're very proud, have been very proud of our voting system for decades now. But President Bolsonaro has been undermining that trust in that system. He has been shedding doubt on the system, has been pushing for a return to paper voting, and it works. When you have so many followers, you're so influential. Many people started really questioning our electronic voting system. So my question is, do you think there might be a repeat in Brazil of what happened in the United States when Trump was defeated in the last general elections? What is the risk of having, even maybe a violent repeat of what happened here in the States in Brazil?
I think there will be a little bit of a repeat of that if President Bolsonaro loses the re-election, which is quite possible, given the information we have. So I think if he loses the re-election, he will naturally challenge the outcome of the election. And the natural argument to make that claim will be that there is something strange about the electronic voting system, which we don't know exactly what it is, but somehow creates some possibility of fraud, right? What is very interesting from a historical perspective is that when the Brazilian electoral system was based on paper ballots, there was a lot of fraud historically, right? Particularly in different regions, in different states, right? There were mechanisms to control the voting count, to buy votes, and so on, to influence that process. And the great advantage of the electronic system has been that process that was flawed in so many ways was eliminated and was streamlined, right? Claiming that we need to go back to paper voting is like claiming that we need to go back to written letters because they're much better and much more reliable than using email or text messages, right? It's just against the nature of our times. In fact, I think that the Brazilian system has been an example for many Latin American countries. So, for example, in Argentina, there has been a lot of reluctance to adopt electronic voting systems because there was always concern that somehow they could be manipulated. And always my response was, well, look at the Brazilian system, right? It's a very complex voting process because people have to vote for individual candidates to Congress and so on. So it's a very complex process, and yet the electronic voting process is very transparent and very effective. So I think inevitably this is going to be used to discredit the election, But at the same time, I think that the Brazilian population has had enough of an experience with this system for such a long time that most people will perceive the system as reliable.
Yeah. So even though the results of the elections cannot be turned over, cannot be changed, but there's going to be still the polarization, right? There's going to still be you're going to still be feeding, the fake news cycle. So it's inevitable to think you're still going to have that kind of polarization if Bolsonaro loses the election.
So losers never like to lose, right? That's always true for all of us, of course. But I think what happened in the past was that because there was a closer memory of the dictatorship and the importance of democracy, losers in Latin America were very careful of always acknowledging that they had lost an election and accepting the legitimacy of the democratic process as a way of strengthening the democratic process. What has happened now, I think, is that as people forget the experience of dictatorship, these partisan issues become more polarizing. It's easier to lose track of the importance of the underlying democratic process. And so we have seen a greater likelihood of losers to denounce the election, to say that the election is not transparent, that there was fraud, that the electronic system is manipulated, right? We have seen, it's likely that we will see this in Brazil, right? President Bolsonaro has been, in a way, preparing the ground for this by questioning the electoral system. We are seeing this to some extent in Mexico. A president with a completely different ideological orientation, and yet he's also questioning the fairness of the National Electoral Institute, which is highly competent and highly technical, also because it's a way of preparing the ground to defend himself. We saw this in the last Peruvian election, in which the loser, Keiko Fujimori, the daughter of Alberto Fujimori, the dictator, she refused to accept the outcome of the election. I think this is a pattern that we are seeing pretty much everywhere, and of course we have seen this in the U.S. too.
What you're saying is so interesting, Professor Aníbal. In preparation for this interview, I was reading the book you co-authored with Professor Scott Mainwaring, Democracies and Dictatorships in Latin America. By the way, I do suggest to you read the book. It's a major academic work. And something interesting you say in the book is that when you talk about Latin America, political actors are very important. Even more than political, culture structures or political structures and cultures. And they were saying this, and I remember that in one of the elections of Lula, his opponent was José Serra, who was a Democrat, and in his defeat speech, when he mentioned Lula victory, his supporters started like boo and boo. And I never forget what he said. He said, no, let's respect the election. So many people lost their lives for us to be where we are now in Brazil, to have free general elections. So let's repeat the voice of the people. And they were saying that, and that was just a few years after the democratization, what happened in 1985. But now it seems like people have really forgotten the importance of that. And one of the things that really mesmerizes me is that nostalgia for return of a dictatorship in Brazil. So as you know, there's this movement of people who go to the streets and say military intervention now with Bolsonaro as president. So can you expand on that a little bit for us? How can you explain? Well, you partially answered, there's a distance and people maybe forget the horrors of living under a dictatorship. But could you expand more? What other factors can explain that, that nostalgia for those dark times?
No, I think that's a great question, and it's very puzzling, right? Why would people have nostalgia for dictatorship? But I think that's not unique to Brazil. It has happened in many places in Latin America, but more broadly in the world. And my sense is that there are three mechanisms operating here. One is the one you pointed out, right? the generational distance to the experience of dictatorship now has been much longer time since dictatorship. So for many young people, the dictatorship is something in the past that they never experienced, then they never suffered. They may have heard their parents or their grandparents talking about it, but they never experienced that directly. And so it's easier to say, okay, this was in the past, now we need to focus on our reality now, and we want answers now, right? And so it's easy to downplay democracy when you have it. It's like oxygen, right? We all enjoy oxygen, but we don't care about it because we take it for granted. That's one thing. The other thing is, our societies have changed so fast in Latin America, but throughout the world, right? There are many norms about gender, about race, about distribution of power in society that have within 50 years, right, they have transformed our societies and the expectations of our societies very quickly. And people experience those norms in different ways. So it is one thing if you are an academic and you live in a certain environment, right, and everybody kind of agrees with you on some issues. And it's a very different story if you live in a completely different environment in which there is a lot of pushback and a lot of debate about those new norms. So I think that many people are trying to navigate the social change in a way that they try to make sense of it, right? And so they are a little bit frustrated with what they perceive as norms that are imposed, new norms about new behaviors that they perceive that they are imposed on them by elites, cosmopolitan elites, right, educated elites that do not represent them. And so all of a sudden, there are new candidates who are saying, oh, we want to go back to the past. The past was fine. There was nothing wrong with it. So we should go back to it. And some people are accepting that, right? And I think, and then finally, the other issue is that I think social media are changing everything, right? Because in social media, we receive a lot of information all the time. And if you are a candidate and you want people to pay attention to you, you want to say something that is really outrageous, right? Because if you say something that is centered, that is careful, that is nuanced, people will not pay any attention to it. If you want people to engage, to be angry, to retweet, to question you, and you want more space in the social networks, you want to something that is shocking to people. Mm-hmm. And this is creating a terrible incentive for candidates to be mean.
Mm-hmm. And that works, right? Because then you become and you stay in the news cycle forever, right? And this is, for a politician, that kind of visibility is important. I found it so interesting what you said about the anxieties that some changes can cause, and then that explains like why you look back to the past when you create a past where it's a safe place, right, to go back to, right, in face of these anxieties. And I guess this connects to our last question, which is about a free press in Brazil. So we've had like relatively free press in Brazil. We have like one problem, as you know, we have like one conglomerate that is very, very powerful. I'm talking about Globo and all its newspapers and TV outlets, and also our current President Bolsonaro has been at war with our free press, right? So my question is, what is the role of press in Brazil? But you also have like outlets who support Bolsonaro, mainly Record. So how do you see, and thinking about that person who has lived in all these anxieties of this changing world, and he looks at Globo and he says, oh, this is attacking my worldview, right? So what are the dangers for democracy when we discredit, all those outlets that have some kind of control on what is said in terms of being true or not, or being fake or not. So talking a little bit about free press and fake news, and the reality of what we live today.
I think that there is a really interesting paradox here in terms of how modern democracy works, which is, on the one hand, we are always very concerned about the big media conglomerates because they have such power of communications that they can control the agenda of public discourse. They can frame the way people see important social problems and economic problems. And sometimes they can dictate the agenda that the government has to respond to, right? And so quite often we see those large media conglomerates as a potential risk for democracy. On the other hand, right, the large media conglomerates are the ones that have the financial muscle and the independence to resist the attacks from the government when the government is willing to undermine the independent press, right? So this is the paradox in a way, that they pose a challenge to democracy, but at the same time they may be the best institution to protect an independent press because they are able to withstand the confrontation with the executive branch, the confrontation with the government, for example, the manipulation of the use of advertisement budgets from the government, which many countries do, in order to manipulate the press, right? Large media conglomerates can withstand those attacks and still have the resources to conduct investigative journalism, for example, and expose cases of corruption in government and so on. So there is this tension all the time. On top of that, I think, which is a traditional tension of the 20th century, so to speak, now we have a new tension, which is the fact that the media environment is much more fragmented than the media environment that we had in the late 20th century. Because of the social networks, now people self-select into the news that they want to hear. So people can decide, okay, I'm going to read the news that my friends read, or I'm going to read the news that tell me kind of the headlines that I want to read.
The confirmation bias.
And
right?
exactly. And so that confirmation bias tends to create communities of people who have a consistent worldview and they do not get any dissonant information. For me, that's a much more threatening reality in terms of the media environment than the dynamic of the big conglomerates.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. That is interesting. And to conclude, how do you see and we talked about like many threats to Brazilian democracy. We covered free press, the undermining of the electronic voting system, the conflict with the Supreme Court. How do you see Brazil holding up? Or how do you see Brazilian democracy holding up? Do you see any possibility of having a coup d'etat, like we had in so many Latin American countries in the 50s, 60s? Do you see that happening, or do you think there are other dangers to Brazilian democracy, 21st dangers to Brazilian democracy?
No, I think that the possibility of a traditional coup d'etat by the military, as in the 1960s, nowadays is extremely low, right? So I don't think that's the main concern for Brazilian democracy or Latin American democracies in general. I think the main concern is that leaders elected through the democratic process and with democratic legitimacy will use the instruments of democracy to dismantle the democratic process from the inside. That's my main concern. But I'm very optimistic about Brazilian democracy because I think that the mechanisms of Brazilian democracy have shown that they are effective. There is this common perception that Brazilian democracy is dysfunctional in many ways because the Congress is highly fragmented, there are too many parties, it's very difficult to make decisions, the president always needs to form coalitions, the Supreme Court blocks many decisions. And in good times, that seems to be an element of dysfunctional operation. But I think in times like this is actually a blessing because it can stop bad things from happening.
Very interesting. Thank you very much, Professor Aníbal Pérez Liñán. Thank you for participating in this episode. Thank you for your insights, for insightful analysis, and see you in the next episode of Brazil Today. Thanks.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you.